Maryland real estate license exam prep, over 16 different questions and answers. I'm just going to read the question and then the answer. These are 16 different tests. Usually they have about 65 questions per test. Which of the following would be defined as real estate as opposed to real property? Answer: wells, driveways, and signs on a parcel of land. Which of the following would be considered a property improvement? A chicken coop permanently attached to land. Which of the following best describes the physical boundaries of land? The center of the earth and infinite space above the earth. The bundle of rights refers to a set of rights enjoyed by the owner of a property. Which of the following best describes the legal concept of personal property? Any item of property that is not definable as real property. The right to encumber a property means that the owner can pledge the property as collateral for debt. A property owner leases 60 acres of agricultural land for a renewable period of 5 years. In the context of real estate rights, this lease represents transfer of a portion of a bundle of rights. A homeowner is very upset over a drone that a neighbor flies over his house. He takes his case to court to end this possible violation of rights. Does he have a case, and on what basis? Yes, the drone infringes on his air rights. Littoral rights apply to which of the following? Navigable lakes, seas, and oceans. A retired couple has just bought a retirement home with a pier on a large lake. In this case, the retiree's water rights extend to the high water mark of the body of water at the shoreline. A waterfront homeowner has just died. What will become of the water rights the owner enjoyed while living in the home? They will transfer with the property when the property is sold. Riparian rights concern which of the following bodies of water? Streams and rivers. Which of the following best describes a fixture? An item of personal property that has been converted to real property. An item may be considered personal property as opposed to real property, provided that the owner intended to remove it after a period of time. Two people own a home, each having an undivided equal interest. Which of the following best describes what each party owns? 50% of the estate consisting of the individual whole of the real property. A real property interest that includes the right to possess is considered an estate in land. The right to control land usage by zoning, an eminent domain, is an example of public interest. If the duration of an owner's rights in an estate is not determinable, the owner has a freehold estate. The distinguishing feature of a leasehold estate is that the estate is limited by a lease term. A landowner conveys a parcel of property with the provision that the land cannot be developed for retail purposes. The new owner immediately begins to develop a retail shop outlet. The grantor finds out about this and takes the property back. What kind of estate does his landowner convey? Fee simple defeasible. Ned grants his sister Alice an estate for as long as she lives. Her descendants, however, cannot inherit the estate. What kind of estate is it? An ordinary life estate. Homestead estates are examples of a legal life estate. Lewis owned a boat and a house before marrying Barbara. While she was single, Barbara owned a new car. The two got married and bought a second home. As a wedding present, Barbara's father bought Lewis a motorcycle. Under the law of community property, what property can Lewis sell without his wife's consent or signature? The boat, the house, and motorcycle. Caitlin rents an apartment for 1 year. What rights has she acquired under her leasehold? The right to possess and use the premises. An estate from period to period will continue as long as the tenant makes and the landlord accepts regular rent payments. An estate at will terminates on death of a lessor or lessee. A tenant continues to occupy an apartment after lease expiration without the consent of the landlord. This type of estate is called an estate at sufferance. A tenant without a lease has been sending the landlord monthly rent checks, and the landlord continues to accept the payments. What kind of leasehold estate is this? Estate from period to period. A fee or life estate is held by an individual. The form of estate is referred to as an tenancy in severalty. 6 people have identical rights in a property and enjoy an individual interest. However, any of these owners may sell or transfer his or her interests without consent of the others. This form of ownership is a tenancy in common. The 4 entities required to create a joint tenancy include which of the following conditions? The parties must acquire respective interest at the same time. Unlike tenants in common, joint tenants cannot will their interest to a party outside of the tenancy. Which of the following life estates is created by operation of law rather than by the owner? Legal life estate. Which of the following is true of a homestead? A homestead interest cannot be conveyed by one spouse. A tenant in common can sell or transfer his interest without the consent of the other tenants in common. Which of the following would be considered community property? Income derived from community property. When real property is held in a land trust, who controls the property? The beneficiary. In a community property state, John marries Patricia. Prior to the marriage, John owned an SUV. During the marriage, John bought a Buick. John and Patricia bought a second property with money earned from Patricia's job, and each individual received a motorcycle from Patricia's uncle as a gift. What property is community property in the marriage? The Buick and the second property. Which of the following is true of a cooperative? A cooperative may hold an owner liable for the unpaid operating expenses of other tenants. Which of the following is true of a tenancy in common? The owners enjoy an indivisible interest. Carissa and Robert acquire a condominium as tenants in common. In this circumstance, Carissa can sell her interest to a third party without the consent of Robert. When a tenant in common dies, what happens to the tenant's interest in the estate? It passes by probate to the deceased tenant's heirs. Which of the following is true of a joint tenancy? The tenants have an equal and indivisible ownership of interest. In contrast to a tenancy in common, a joint tenancy, there is a single title on the property. If a joint tenant sells his or her interest to an outside party, the new owner becomes a tenant in common with the other owners who continue to hold a joint tenancy with each other and a tenancy in common with the new owner. When a joint tenant dies, what happens to the tenant's interest in the estate? It passes to the surviving joint tenants. Under what conditions can two individuals own a property as tenants by the entireties? If they are married. When an estate is held in a trust, which party holds legal title? The trustee. Tanya buys a 4-bedroom condominium as a new owner. She has the right to sell or mortgage the unit without impediment from individual owners of neighboring units. A condominium owner's share of maintenance and operation expenses are based on the unit's pro rata share of the property value as defined in the declaration. By contrast to condominium, the owner of a cooperative owns shares in a corporation or association and a proprietary lease in a physical unit. In a cooperative, real property is owned only by the corporate entity of the cooperative association. In a timeshare freehold, owners acquire undivided interest in the property as tenants in common. A party has just purchased a manufacturing house unit. When is the property considered real property? As soon as it is affixed to the ground. Now, this section is on encumbrances. Liens, title, transfer, recording, and leases. Which of the following describes an encumbrance? A third party's interest in a real property that limits the interest of the freehold property owner. Which of the following is true of an easement in general? They involve the property that contains the easement and a non-owning property. Mr. King wants to offer 100 acres of his property for sale. Since the property is landlocked, he will have to put in a driveway to the road that will run across his remaining property. What kind of easement will he have to grant? An easement opportunant. If a property alpha has a court-ordered easement across property beta in order for alpha to have access to public road, an easement is an easement by necessity. An encroachment is An unauthorized physical intrusion of a property onto another. A court might grant an easement by prescription if a trespasser has been using an owner's property for a certain period with the owner's knowledge but without permission. The purpose of the deed restriction is to enable an owner to specify how a property may be used and what improvements may be built on it. Melinda purchases a house and finances it. The lender in turn places a lien on Melinda's title. The lien in this mortgage transaction is the creditor's claim against the property as collateral security for the loan. In a lien theory state, what kind of interest does a mortgage lender have in the liened property? An equitable interest. How is a lien terminated? Payment of the debt that is subject of the lien, recording of the satisfaction. A judgment rules in favor of the creditor in a court proceedings and places judgment lien against all the debtor's assets, including his real property. This is an example of involuntary general lien. A real estate tax lien, a federal income tax lien, a judgment lien, and a mortgage lien are recorded against a property. Which lien will be paid first when the property is sold? Real estate tax lien. A lien holder can change the lien priority of a junior lien by agreeing to subordinate the loan. Which of the following would accurately describe the act of foreclosure? A proceeding to enforce a lien by forcing the sale or transfer of a secured property. A property is secured by a mortgage that does not contain a power of sale clause. To foreclose, the lien holder will have to file a foreclosure suit. A homeowner defaults on his mortgage loan. In a subsequent foreclosure action, the lender takes title to the liened property directly instead of initiating a court-ordered public sale. This is an example of non-judicial foreclosure. A property owner gives Deanna permission to cross his property as a shortcut to her kindergarten school bus. One day the property owner dies. What right was Deanna granted originally, and will it survive the owner's death? A license, which terminates upon the owner's death. On two adjacent properties, there is an easement that allows property A to use the driveway that belongs to property B. Here, property A is said to be which of the following in relation to property B? Dominant tenant. A property owner who is selling her land wants to control how it is used for the future. She might accomplish her aim by means of a deed restriction. What distinguishes a lien from other types of encumbrances? It involves a monetary claim against the value of a property. What of the following defines actual notice? It is knowledge received or imparted through direct experience. Which of the following defines constructive notice? It is a knowledge one could have or should have obtained. Ownership of real estate can be transferred voluntarily or involuntarily. The three ways title can be transferred voluntarily are by a grant, a deed, and a will. What is the function of recording a deed? It gives constructive notice of ownership. The only clause that is actually required in a deed is the granting clause. The type of deed that offers the grantee the fullest protection against claims to the title is the general warranty deed. Which is one of the purposes of a lawsuit to quiet a title? To have an encumbrance removed if the lien holder cannot prove its validity. Which of the following best describes the documentary stamp tax? A transfer tax based on the price of the property being conveyed. The court proceedings that generally settles a decedent's estate is called probate. If an owner of real property dies intestate and has no legal heirs, what would happen to the property? It will escheat to the state or the county. A municipality wants to build a sewage treatment facility which will require the acquisition of several parcels of privately owned land. What legal power enables the municipality to buy the necessary properties even against the owner's wishes? Eminent domain. An adverse possession must be able to successfully demonstrate that he or she has been openly possessing and claiming the property without the owner's consent. A buyer has signed a contract to purchase a property, but is uncertain of the condition of the title. Which of the following parties is legal responsibility for knowing the condition of the title? The buyer. A break in the chain of title to a property results in a clouded title. Wayne and Lueta obtain an insurance policy that protects them from liabilities and losses resulting from the defects. This kind of policy they bought is a standard owner's title insurance policy. An owner transfers title to a property to a buyer in exchange for a motorcycle. This is an example of voluntary alienation. A person wishes to convey any and all interest in a property to another without insurance of the property's marketability. This party would most likely use which of the following types of deed? A quit-claim deed. Jennifer owns 1/2 interest in a condominium as a tenant in common with her business partner. If Jennifer has several heirs and dies without a will, the property will pass to her heirs by the laws of the descent and distribution. A drifter secretly lives in an abandoned shack on a large ranch property. After 20 years, the person makes a claim of ownership to the shack and the land immediately surrounding it that he had been cleared. This claim will likely be declined because possession was secretive. To be marketable, title must be free of undisclosed defects and encumbrances. Which of the following types of leasehold estate lacks a specific term? Estate at will. A landlord generally has the right to enter the leased premises for specified reasonable purposes. When a tenant rents an apartment, he or she is usually responsible for compliance with the rules and regulations of the building. Under landlord-tenant laws, landlords must treat tenants fairly and honestly. In a residential leasehold, this requirement would include providing required building support and services. While on a year lease, while a 1-year lease is in effect, the tenant dies of sudden illness. In this situation, the tenant's estate is still obligated under the lease. 3 students rent a house together, and all 3 sign a 1-year lease. 6 months later, 2 students move out. Which of the following is true of the remaining obligation? The remaining tenant is responsible for the full rent obligation. A tenant transfers a portion of a leasehold interest to one party. The instrument that accomplishes this transfer is an sublease. Michael enters into a lease for his new store. The provisions of the lease require Michael to pay the operating expenses of the premises, such as janitorial and repair expenses. This is an example of a net lease. A tenant obtains a full-service lease where the landlord agrees to pay for all operating expenses in exchange for an additional $5 rent per square foot. Another term for this lease is a gross lease. Which of the following circumstance is most likely a scenario for a ground lease? An owner-developer wants to retain ownership of the land portion of the improved real property. A tenancy at will can usually be determined by either party giving proper notice. Under the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, if a lease does not state or clear expiration date, the lease is regarded as a tenancy from period to period. The Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act generally does not apply to a hotel. In executing a condominium lease, a tenant has acquired a temporary possessory interest. When a tenant acquires a leasehold estate through a lease, what does the property owner acquire? A leasehold fee estate. When an owner leases her property, she temporarily relinquishes her right to occupy the property. Which of the following happens when a leased property is sold? The buyer acquires title subject to the lease, which remains in effect. If a lease does not state a specific ending date, when does it terminate? When either party gives proper notice. In accordance with the statute of frauds, a 5-year lease must be in writing to be enforceable. Which of the following is true of a sublease? The original tenant retains primary responsibility for performance of the original lease contract. A homeowner goes bankrupt and the lender forecloses on her residence. In a foreclosure sale, the proceedings are insufficient to pay off the loan, and the court orders other property sold to cover the shortfall. This action is called deficiency judgment. To make a successful claim of adverse possession, the adverse possessor must satisfy which of the following criteria? The possession must have been unconcealed for the necessary length of time and without permission. One of the primary benefits of recording conveyances is to give evidence to the public that the new owner actually owns the property. What is another benefit of recording to the homeowner? Recording instruments establishes the title's marketability. Test 3, land use, legal descriptions, and contract law. Which of the following is true regarding master planning and zoning? Zoning ordinances are primary means of keeping land use in harmony with the master plan. The basic intent of zoning ordinances is to specify usage for every parcel within the zoning authority's jurisdiction. Why do zoning authorities create different types of zones? To separate land uses so that they do not interfere with each other. The key consideration in granting a zoning exception as a special exemption is which of the following? The public interest. The intensity of land usage generally refers to what? The area of a commercial or industrial facility in relation to the size of the site. How does planned unit development zoning vary from ordinary zoning? It requires that multiple tracts of land be developed according to a single design. Which of the following situations is most likely to represent an illegal non-conforming use? A homeowner in a residential zone converts her residence to provide to a private school. What is the difference between a variance and a non-conforming use? A variance is granted by the zoning board if the owner has justifiable reason. A document certifying that a structure complies with the building codes and is ready for use is referred to as certificate of occupancy. Which of the following is true of an eminent domain proceeding? It conveys legal title to the acquiring entity. Among other provisions, the Superfund Act, CERCLA, and Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act of 1986 provide what? That parties responsible for proper disposal of hazard waste could be charged for the cleanup costs. Public land use planning strives to balance which of the following potential conflicting interests? Individual property rights and the public's interest. Zoning, building codes, and environmental restrictions are forms of local land use controls known as police power. If a municipality exerts its power of eminent domain against a certain property owner, what happens? The owner must sell the property in exchange for market value compensation. To be valid, a local zoning ordinance must reasonably promote community health, safety, and welfare. Why do communities require building permits? To ensure that improvements comply with codes. What is the purpose of residential zoning? To regulate the density of dwellings in the residential zone. A non-profit organization wants to erect an urgent care facility in a residential zone. Given other favorable circumstances, the local authorities may grant permission by allowing a special exception. A property that conformed with zoning ordinances when it was developed but does not conform to new ordinances is said to be a legal non-conforming use. The approval process for developing of multiple properties in an area includes submission of a plat of subdivision. The legal description of a property is one which accurately identifies the boundaries of the property as distinct from all other properties. The essential elements of meters and bounds systems are reference points, angles, and distances. In a rectangular survey system, a range is the area in between two consecutive meridians. In the rectangular survey system, a tier is defined as two consecutive parallels. In the rectangular survey system, what are the dimensions of a township? 6 miles by 6 miles or 6 miles square. What portion of a section is 10 acres? 1/64. The lot and block system of legally describing property is used for properties in a subdivision. A certain legal description contains the phrase northwesterly along Erie Road to the POB. What kind of description is this? Meets and bounds. How many sections are there in a township? 36. In a rectangular survey system, a section contains how many acres? 640. The valuable consideration necessary to make a contract valid must be something of value traded in exchange for something of value. A real estate sales contract to be enforceable must contain a legal description of the property. How much time does a seller have to accept a buyer's offer? A reasonable time or until the expiration date of the offer. The buyer submits an offer to a seller and then dies in a car accident. Before learning of the buyer's death, the seller accepts the offer. Which of the following is true? The buyer's death terminates the offer. Which of the following contracts can be assigned to one another? A contract for the sale of undeveloped land. An implied agency relationship may be determined to exist if the parties act is if there are two I'll read that one again. An implied agency relationship may be deemed to exist if the parties act is if there is a contract. Which of the following is an executory contract? A sale contract before closing. A bilateral contract is one in which both parties promise to do something in exchange for other parties' performance. A home seller signs a listing agreement with a broker, then subsequently revokes the listing. Which of the following is true? The broker may have a claim for marketing expenses expanded during the lease term or the listing term. A breach of contract is the failure of a party to perform according to the terms of the contract. What is rescission? The act of declaring that a contract is no longer in effect for a given party. To be valid, a valid contract must reflect a mutual understanding or agreement. Two parties enter a contract. The agreement fulfills all of the requirements for a valid contract with no disqualifying circumstances. Given the situation, it is still possible that the contract may be unenforceable. The guardian for a mentally incompetent party enters into an oral contract with another party to buy a trade fixture on behalf of the incompetent party. This contract is possibly valid and enforceable. A prospective homebuyer submits a signed offer with the condition that the seller pays for the inspection at closing. The seller disagrees, crosses out the provision, then signs and returns the document to the buyer. At this point, assuming all other contract validity items are in order, the original offer is now a counter offer. A construction contract executes a contract with the buyer. In the agreement, the contractor promises to complete construction by November 20th. This promise can be construed as valuable consideration. A seller contracts to sell a property that she does not own. The sale contract for this transaction is void. The state of limitations requires that parties to a contract who have been damaged or who have questioned the contract's provisions must act within a statutory period. The purpose of the statute of frauds is to require certain conveyance-related contracts to be in writing. A seller immediately accepts a buyer's offer, but waits 10 days before returning the accepted document to the buyer. Meanwhile, the offer has expired. Which of the following is true? The buyer has no obligation to the seller whatsoever. Test 4, agency listing agreements. The agency relationship is defined by the laws of agency, or in some states, by statute. Which of the following is true of the connection between compensation and the agency relationship? The relationship is independent of any compensation arrangement. One of the parties to an agency relationship defaults and the agreement terminates, which of the following is true? The defaulting party may have a financial consequence. Among the fiduciary duties imposed on a real estate agent is the requirement to present all offers to the principal regardless of their amount. One of the agent's fiduciary duties that continues even after a listing agreement expires is confidentiality. The standard of care and competence that a principal can expect from an agent is generally that which is comparable to that of other practitioners in the area. Agent Michael is showing his new listing to a buyer who informs him that he has just inherited $5 million. Michael is now a rich motherfucker. No, Michael is now bound by fiduciary duty to... I don't even have the answer for that one. The answer is keep the information in confidence. Number 48. Or 4.8. Agent Jerry has executed an exclusion buyer-broker agreement with the Andersons. The agent subsequently places an offer with Melinda, the exclusive selling agent for the Lincolns, to buy their lakefront property. The offer contains provisions for the Lincolns to pay the brokerage commission, which the Lincolns agree to. Given the set of circumstances, Jerry owes the full set of fiduciary duties to the Andersons. A subagent is the agent of a broker who has an agency relationship with a client. Which of the following is a dual agency situation? One agent represents both sides in a transaction. The duties of transaction broker or facilitator include disclosing material facts that affect the value of the property to both parties. In which of the following contact situations would a seller's agent be expected to disclose his agency relationship? The agent is showing the client's property to a prospective buyer. The essential foundations of agency relationship consist of good faith, trust, and confidence. Audrey wants to take a vacation. To do so, she authorizes an agent to conduct the operations of one of her business enterprises. The kind of agency she has established is general. A property seller empowers an agent to market and sell property on his behalf. The kind of agency represented is special. Implied agency arises when a party creates an agency relationship outside of an express agreement. An agency relationship may be involuntary, terminated for which of the following reasons? Condemnation of a property. A principal discloses that she would sell a property for $500,000. During the listing period, the house is listed and marketed for $530,000. No offers come in and the listing expires. 3 weeks later, the agent confides to a customer that the seller would have sold for less than the listed price. Which of the following is true? The agent has violated the duty of confidentiality. A principal instructs an agent to market a property only to families on the west side of the university campus. The agent refuses to comply. In this case, the agent has not violated fiduciary duty. An owner's agent is showing a buyer a residential property for sale. The buyer notices water stains on the foundation walls and the floors and informs the agent. The appropriate course of action for the agent is to inform the seller. The meaning and the salient characteristics of an agency relationship would be disclosed to the client prior to completing a listing agreement. And I'll read that again. The meaning and salient characteristics of the agency relationship should be disclosed to the client prior to completing a listing agreement. When must a listing agent disclose his or her agency relationship to prospective tenants or buyers? Whenever substantive communication is made beyond casual conversation. A buyer agent or tenant representative should disclose his or her agency relationship to the owner's agent upon initial contact. An agent is operating as a disclosed dual agent on a transaction. In this case, the agent may not represent one party's interests to the detriment of the other. An agent informs a buyer that a provision in a contract is very commonplace. After explaining the clause, the agent assures the buyer that the clause does not mean anything significant. If something goes wrong with the transaction, the agent could be liable for practicing law without a license. When a broker enters into a listing agreement, the broker has agreed to accept which of the following: fiduciary and contractual obligation with the client. The degree of authority granted by a residential brokerage listing agreement generally allows the agent to market, sell, and show the property. A salesperson without an oral or written listing agreement brings potential buyers to the seller. The seller says, "You can bring me buyers if you want, but I'm not paying you a commission." The salesperson then continues to direct buyers to the property. Which of the following is true about this situation? An implied agency may have been created with the obligation to perform both seller and agent. An agent enters into a listing agreement with a home seller, but then becomes too busy to professionally fulfill the terms of the agreement. To solve the dilemma, the agent assigns the agreement to another licensed in the office. Which of the following is true about this situation? The agent cannot assign the listing agreement. From an agent's point of view, the most desirable form of listing agreement is an exclusive right to sell. What is a multiple listing? A listing that is entered in a multiple listing service to enable cooperation with member brokers. Which of the following conditions is necessary for a customer to qualify as ready, willing, and able in the context of a commissionable transaction? The customer must be legally competent to undertake the transaction. Although a listing broker may delegate listing tasks to an employed licensee, the broker may not delegate the authority to obtain and distribute compensation. Agent Peter has an open listing with Frank. Paul is Peter's broker. Agent Perry's customers buy Frank's home. Patrick has a commission agreement with Frank. Who is most likely to be compensated in this scenario? Perry, since he found the customer. If an agent has an exclusive listing to sell a property, and the property is then taken by eminent domain, what is the situation in the status and situation of the listing? It may be terminated against the agent's will. A broker obtains an exclusive listing to sell a house, but after 2 months, he abandons the listing because the seller is too demanding and hot-tempered. What can the seller do in this situation? Sue the broker for money damages. An owner agrees to pay a broker for procuring a tenant unless it is the owner who finds the tenant. This is an example of exclusive agency agreement. A landlord promises to compensate a broker for procuring a tenant, provided the broker is the procuring cause. This is an example of open rental listing. A property owner agrees to pay a broker an open-ended commission as the difference between the sale price and the net amount, provided the owner receives a minimum amount of proceeds from sale at closing. This is an example of net listing. In the context of agency law, the legal difference between an owner representation agreement and a buyer representation agreement is the client. A multiple listing authorization gives a broker what authority? To list the owner's property in a multiple listing service. Test number 5, brokerage business sale contracts. Which of the following business entities is generally prohibited from brokering real estate? A nonprofit corporation. A joint venture may generally broker real estate if the co-venturers are properly licensed. A licensed salesperson may work only for a single employing broker who has an active broker's license. Which of the following activities is a licensed salesperson allowed to engage in? Offer a property for lease on behalf of the employing broker. If a salesperson has worked on a complicated transaction that involved a listing agent, a selling agent, and several sub-agents for each of these, from whom will the salesperson receive any compensation that is due? The employing broker. A property has sold for $380,000. The listing agreement calls for a commission of 6.5%. The listing broker and selling broker agree to share the commission equally. What is the listing agent's to receive if the agent is scheduled to get a 40% share? $4,940. A real estate salesperson finds a buyer to a for sale by owner property. The home sells for $245,000 and the seller agrees to pay a commission of 3%. The salesperson is on a 65% commission schedule with her broker, who pays her 65% minus office expenses of $500. How much will the salesperson receive from the transaction? $4,278. A salesperson makes a listing presentation to a home seller and obtains a signed listing agreement. The first thing the salesperson must do now is complete the signing of the listing. Juan shows a customer a property that is listed by another brokerage firm. He obtains an offer that is $5,000 less than the listing price. How should Juan deal with this offer? Present the offer to the seller at the earliest possible moment. A broker receives an earnest money deposit from a buyer and signs the check over to the listing agent as a partial commission advance. What is wrong with this procedure? The broker has illegally converted security funds for business use. Under what circumstance may a property listed for sale with the brokerage be advertised without identifying the broker? Never. Never. Competing brokers in a county seat agree on a standard commission rate for principals within the county. This is a possible violation of fair trade and antitrust laws. What is a co-brokerage? Outside brokers assist a listing agent in procuring a buyer. Which of the following may associate his or her name or title with the term realtor? Only members of the National Association of Realtors. Real estate sales agents are legally authorized to represent their employing broker in procuring clients and customers. How does the position of an independent contractor license, or IC, differ from that of an employee licensee? The IC is responsible for his or her own taxes. The broker does not withhold. A salesperson's commission rate and structure is established by competitive conditions. In obtaining offers from a buyer, an agent must be careful to avoid disclosing what price the owner will accept. Commingling is the practice of mixing escrow funds with the broker's operating funds. 3 leading agencies charge identical commission rates for brokering office properties in Phoenix. Based on this information alone, which of the following is true? There is insufficient evidence of anything other than normal business practice. A real estate sale contract is an executory contract until all the obligations and promises are performed and the transaction is closed. In assisting a buyer or seller to complete an offer to purchase, what should an agent do to reduce the risk of committing an unauthorized practice of law? Use the standard contract promulgated by a state agency or a real estate board. To be enforceable, a contract for conveyance of real estate must be in writing. A buyer makes an offer to purchase a house, and the seller accepts the offer. However, Before the salesperson can inform the buyer of the seller's decision, the buyer delivers a written notice that she is opting out of and canceling the agreement. At this point, which of the following is true? The contract has been legitimately canceled and is null and void. Which of the following is essential element of valid contract for the sale of real estate? An offer and acceptance. What kind of interest does the buyer acquire once a real estate sale contract is signed by the principal parties? Equitable title. A contingency is a sale contract that is a condition that, if unmet, renders the contract unenforceable. A clause in a sales contract stipulates that the seller must provide evidence that the property is free of active termite infestation. On the day of closing, the buyer learns that the inspection service did not provide the required written documentation. The buyer then proceeds to declare that the sale is off. Which of the following is true in this situation? The buyer may be able to have the contract canceled. A buyer signs an earnest money agreement and gives it to the broker who showed her the property she is buying. After leaving the broker's office, she reconsiders and decides she prefers a different property. How long does she have to take back her offer? Until the seller communicates acceptance of the offer. On Wednesday, Fred offers to sell his property to Jack for $275,000, with the offer to remain open until 5 p.m. the next day. On Thursday morning, Sally offers Fred $280,000 for the property, and Fred accepts. At 1 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, Jack accepts. Which of the following is true of this situation? Fred has entered into contracts with both Jack and Sally to sell the same property. Among the items that normally must be disclosed in a sale contract, or it is addenda, are the agency relationship and property conditions. And I'll read that again. Among the items that normally must be disclosed in a sale contract or its addendum are agency relationship and property conditions. To create an enforceable option to buy contract, there must be an exchange of valuable consideration and a right to buy. Mary Carboy buys a house from Jim Schmidt and at the same time obtains an option to purchase the adjoining vacant lot for $10,000 within 1 year. A few months later, Carboy informs Schmidt that she is already to exercise her option, but finds that Schmidt has received an offer for $12,000 from another property. Schmidt states that he will accept her offer unless the Carboy is willing to match the $12,000 offer. Which of the following is true of this situation? Schmidt must sell the Carboy for $10,000. Which of the following is true regarding the assignability of an option? It is always assignable unless the contract prohibits otherwise. Which of the following is true of contract for deed transaction? At the end of the contract period, the vendor conveys legal title, providing the vendee has fulfilled all obligations. Which of the following is true of contract for deed transaction? At the end of the contract period, the vendor conveys legal title, providing the vendee has fulfilled all the obligations. Several buyers are competing for the last available home in a desirable new subdivision. One buyer calls the owner developer directly on the phone and offers $20,000 over the above listed price. The developer accepts the offer. At this point, the parties have completed a verbal executory contract. An owner completes a sales contract on her property with a buyer. Before closing, the seller runs into financial trouble and assigns the contract to her principal creditor. The buyer cries foul, fearing the property will be lost. Which of the following is true? The assigner has completed a legal action. Due on sale clause in a sale contract puts parties on notice that any conveyance may trigger an acceleration of any loans secured by the property. A tenant has an option to purchase agreement with the landlord that expires on June 30th. On July 1st, a tenant frantically calls the landlord to exercise the option, offering the apology that she was busy with death in the family. Which of the following is true? The option is expired and the tenant has no rightful claim to money paid for the option. Two parties enter into a contract for deed agreement. In this form of agreement, the seller retains legal title while the buyer makes partial payments until the contract is fully executed. The federal law that produced the do not call list and release protection is referred to as Telephone Consumer Protection Act. New federal regulation in advertising requires email advertisers to give recipients an option to discontinue receiving emails from such advertiser. This legislation is called the CAN-SPAM Act.